The blood pooled like dark wine in the lamplight, and Grace Atwood knew with sudden, terrible clarity that she should not have come upstairs to check on the shouting. She stood frozen in the doorway of the hotel room, her hand still gripping the tray of clean linen she had been bringing up for the morning turnover. Inside, 3 men stood around a 4th who lay crumpled on the floor, his chest soaked red, eyes staring at nothing. The man nearest the door held a smoking revolver, and when he turned to look at her, Grace recognized him immediately. Everyone in Fort Worth, Texas knew Vincent Crane, the cattle baron who owned half the county and seemed to think that made him above the law. "Well now," Crane said, his voice eerily calm. "Seems we have a witness?" Grace did not wait to hear more. The tray clattered to the floor as she spun and ran, her boots pounding against the wooden floorboards of the Riverside Hotel's second-floor hallway. Behind her, she heard shouting, the scrape of chairs, heavy footsteps giving chase. "Get her!" Crane's voice boomed. "She cannot leave this building." Grace flew down the stairs, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The hotel lobby was empty at this late hour, just past midnight on a Tuesday in March of 1882. The night clerk had stepped out for his usual smoke, and Grace blessed that small mercy as she crashed through the front door and onto the muddy streets of Fort Worth. The spring rains had turned the roads into a slick mess, and Grace nearly fell twice as she ran. She had no plan, no destination, only the primal need to get away from the men who would surely kill her to keep their secret. She could hear them behind her, their shouts carrying through the quiet night air. Grace darted between buildings, her lungs burning. She had lived in Fort Worth for 3 years, working at the hotel to send money back to her ailing mother in Tennessee, and she knew these streets well enough. But knowing streets and knowing where to hide from murderers were 2 different things entirely. Crane had the sheriff in his pocket, everyone knew it. Going to the law would be the same as walking back into that hotel room and lying down beside the corpse. She ran toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie. It was foolish, she knew, but staying in Fort Worth meant death. At least out in the wild country she might have a chance, slim as it was. The sound of hoofbeats behind her made her blood run cold. They had gotten horses. Grace pushed herself harder, her skirts tangling around her legs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had perhaps 100 yards on them now, but that would disappear quickly once they got their horses up to speed. Just when she thought her legs would give out entirely, Grace saw it. A small ranch house set back from the road, with a barn and a corral. A single light burned in the window. Without thinking, she veered toward it, praying whoever lived there would not simply hand her over to Crane's men. She stumbled into the yard and nearly collided with a man leading a horse toward the barn. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn leather vest over a work shirt, his dark hair visible beneath his hat in the moonlight. "Please," Grace gasped, clutching at his arm. "Please, they're going to kill me. Please help me." The man looked at her, then passed her to where the sound of approaching horses grew louder. His face remained remarkably calm, his gray eyes assessing the situation with a speed that suggested he was used to making quick decisions. "The barn," he said simply, his voice low and steady. "Go to the back, behind the hay bales. Do not make a sound." Grace did not wait for him to change his mind. She ran to the barn, slipped inside the dark interior, and felt her way to the back, where she found a space behind stacked hay that smelled of dried grass in summer. She wedged herself into the narrow gap and tried to control her breathing, pressing her hand over her mouth to muffle the sound. Minutes later, she heard the horses arrive in the yard. Through a gap in the barn wall, she could see the man still standing there, now holding a rifle casually across his chest. 3 riders had pulled up before him, their horses stamping and blowing. "Evening," the man said, his tone conversational. "Little late for visiting." "We are looking for a woman," one of the riders said. Grace recognized the voice as belonging to Frank Dougherty, one of Crane's foremen. "She came running this way. You seen her?" "Have not seen anyone." the man replied. Been out here working on a fence line, horse through a shoe, just getting back now. Mind if we look around? Another voice, harder edged. I do mind, actually, the man said, and though his tone remained even, something in it made Grace shiver. It is my property, and I do not take kindly to people riding onto it after midnight making demands. You have a warrant, you come back in daylight with the sheriff, otherwise I suggest you move along. There was a long, tense silence. Grace held her breath, certain they would simply shoot this stranger who was protecting her and search the barn anyway. Xander Gaines, Frank Dougherty said slowly, you do not want to make an enemy of Mr. Crane. So that was his name, Xander Gaines. Grace committed it to memory, this man who might be about to die for her. I am not making an enemy of anyone, Xander replied. I am standing on my own land telling you I have not seen what you are looking for. Now, if you want to call me a liar, you are welcome to try backing that up. Otherwise, get off my property. The silence stretched even longer this time. Then she heard the creak of saddle leather as one of the men shifted his weight. We will be back, Frank said finally. And if we find out you are lying, you know where to find me, Xander said. I will be right here, same as always. The riders left, but slowly, as if reluctant to give up. Grace stayed frozen in her hiding spot long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, not daring to move until she heard Xander's voice from the barn door. They are gone, he said quietly. You can come out now. Grace emerged on shaking legs, hay clinging to her dark hair, and the simple gray dress she wore for work. In the better light of the barn's lantern, which Xander had lit, she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 30 years old, with a weathered face that spoke of years working outdoors, and those startling gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing. There was a scar along his jawline, faint but visible, and his hands were calloused and strong. Thank you, Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. I do not know what they would have done if— Sit down before you fall down, Xander interrupted, gesturing to a barrel near the wall. You look about ready to collapse. Grace sat, her legs grateful for the support. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the shock was setting in, and she found herself starting to shake in earnest. Xander disappeared for a moment and returned with a tin cup of water. Drink, he ordered, pressing it into her hands. She did, the cool water helping to settle her stomach. When she looked up, she found Xander watching her with that same calm, assessing gaze. I am not going to ask what happened, he said, and I am not going to ask your name if you do not want to give it. But those men will be back, probably with more, and they will search this place top to bottom. You cannot stay here. I have nowhere else to go, Grace said, and hated how defeated she sounded. They will kill me if they find me. I saw— She stopped, remembering his words. He said he would not ask, and she should not tell him more than necessary. The less he knew, the safer he would be. Xander was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on her face. Then he nodded, as if coming to some internal decision. There is a line cabin up in the hills about 5 miles north of here, he said. I use it during roundup, but it is empty now. There is a creek nearby for water, and I can bring you supplies. You could stay there until we figure out what to do next. Why are you helping me? Grace asked. You do not know me. I could be a criminal. I could be lying. Xander's expression did not change. Could be, he agreed. But I saw your face when you ran into this yard. That was not the look of someone running from justice. That was the look of someone running from something evil. I have seen enough of both to know the difference. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, the first since this nightmare had begun. This stranger, this cowboy who owed her nothing, was offering her salvation without asking for anything in return, not even an explanation. My name is Grace, she said. Grace Atwood. Xander Gaines, he replied, though she already knew. Can you ride? Yes, Grace said. My father had horses before he died. Good. We will leave within the hour. They will be watching the roads and likely my house by morning. We need to get you up to that cabin before first light. The next hour passed in a blur. Xander moved with efficient purpose, gathering supplies and packing them onto a sturdy pack horse while Grace waited in the barn. He brought her a coat, worn but warm, and a hat to hide her hair. When he led 2 horses out, both saddled and ready, Grace felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. They rode north, keeping to the creek beds and rocky ground where their tracks would be harder to follow. Xander set a steady pace, not so fast as to tire the horses, but quick enough to cover ground. He seemed to know every inch of this country, guiding them through draws and over ridges with the sureness of a man who had ridden this land 1,000 times. Grace followed, clinging to the saddle horn when the terrain grew rough, her body aching from the fear and exertion of the night. But she did not complain. This man was risking everything for her, and she would not add to his burden. Dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold when they finally reached the line cabin. It was a small, rough structure built of logs and chinked with mud, with a single door and 1 window covered by a wooden shutter. But to Grace, it looked like paradise. Xander dismounted and helped her down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Grace's legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and he caught her elbow to steady her. "Sorry," she murmured. "I am not usually so weak." "You've had a rough night," Xander said, releasing her arm once he was sure she could stand. "Anyone would be feeling it. Come on, let us get you inside." The cabin's interior was sparse but clean. There was a small stove in one corner, a rope bed frame with a thin mattress, a table with 2 chairs, and some shelves holding basic supplies. Xander set about starting a fire in the stove while Grace stood awkwardly in the center of the room, unsure what to do with herself. "There is coffee in the tin on the shelf," Xander said as he worked, "and some dried beef and beans. Not fancy, but it will keep you fed. The creek is about 50 yards east, through those trees you can see from the window. Water is clean and cold." "What about you?" Grace asked. "Will you not stay?" "I have to get back," Xander said. "If I am not at my ranch when Crane's men come back, they will know something is wrong. Better they find me there, acting normal, like I have nothing to hide." Fear clutched at Grace's chest. "What if they hurt you? What if they—" "They will not," Xander said with certainty. "Crane might have the sheriff in his pocket, but he does not have everyone. There are people in this county who would ask questions if something happened to me. I will be fine." He finished with the stove and stood, brushing dust from his hands. "I will come back in 3 days with more supplies and news. Until then, stay inside as much as you can. Do not light the stove during the day when the smoke could be seen, only at night, and bank it good so it does not make much smoke." "I do not know how to thank you," Grace said, her throat tight with emotion. "No need for thanks," Xander replied. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. "You are safe here, Grace. That is all that matters." Then he was gone, and Grace was alone in the little cabin with the sound of his horse's hoofbeats fading into the distance. The next 3 days were the longest of Grace's life. She rationed the supplies carefully, eating only enough to keep her strength up, and spent her time pacing the small cabin or staring out the window at the endless prairie. Every sound made her jump, certain it was Crane's men coming to drag her back to town. But no one came except birds, and once a deer that wandered close to drink from the creek. Grace thought constantly about what she had seen in that hotel room. The dead man had been Peter Morrison, a rival cattle buyer who had been in town negotiating for contracts. She had heard rumors that Crane was furious about Morrison trying to undercut his prices, but she had never imagined it would lead to murder. Now Morrison was dead, and 3 men, including the most powerful person in the county, had committed the crime. If she went to the law, would anyone believe her word against Crane's? And even if they did, would she live long enough to testify? These thoughts circled endlessly in her mind until the afternoon of the 3rd day when she heard a horse approaching. Grace's heart leaped into her throat, and she grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the stove, the only thing resembling a weapon in the cabin. But when the door opened, it was Xander, carrying saddlebags over one shoulder and wearing that same calm expression. "Easy," he said when he saw the poker. "Just me." Grace set the poker down with shaking hands. "I am sorry, I have been jumping at every sound." "Understandable," Xander said. He set the saddlebags on the table and began unpacking them. Brought you more food, some bread, eggs packed in cornmeal, more coffee and bacon, and these? He pulled out a bundle of clothing, a split riding skirt, 2 shirts, and a pair of sturdy boots. Figured you might want something more practical than that dress. These belong to my sister. She's back east now, married to a banker. I think they will fit well enough. Grace stared at the clothes, then at Xander. Your sister's clothes? Will she not mind? She left them behind when she went east. Said she wanted no reminders of ranch life. There was something in his tone that suggested old pain, but he moved on quickly. How have you been managing? Well enough, Grace said. No one has come. I have been careful with the fire, like you said. Xander nodded and pulled out a chair, settling into it with a weariness that suggested the last 3 days had not been easy for him either. Crane's men searched my place top to bottom the morning after you ran. Tore through the house and barn like they were looking for buried gold. I let them, made them think I had nothing to hide. Sheriff was with them, looking uncomfortable but not doing anything to stop it. Did they find anything? Grace asked, though she knew they could not have. Of course not. You were long gone. Xander rubbed a hand over his face. But here's the thing. They are saying Peter Morrison was killed by robbers who got into his room, found his money gone and everything. Crane is acting the concerned citizen, offering a reward for information. Grace felt cold. He is covering it up. Seems like, Xander agreed, which means he is not actively searching for you, at least not publicly. But I heard talk in town. Crane's put out word with his men to watch for a woman matching your description. Says he wants to question you as a possible witness. For your safety, of course. Of course, Grace echoed bitterly. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Xander leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gray eyes serious. I have been thinking about this, Coricius, he said. You cannot stay here forever, and you cannot go back to town. But there might be another option. I have a friend, Jacob Warren, who runs a ranch about 80 miles west of here. He is a good man, honest, and he owes me a favor. I could send word, see if he needs help. You could work there under a different name, start over. 80 miles is not very far, Grace said. What if Crane hears about me? Jacob's ranch is in a different county, different law. Crane's influence does not reach that far. And if you change your name, your look, you would just be another ranch hand or house worker. No reason for anyone to connect you to what happened here. It made sense, Grace had to admit. But the thought of leaving, of running even farther away, filled her with a strange reluctance she did not entirely understand. She looked at Xander, at his honest face and steady eyes, and realized the reluctance had something to do with him. What about you? She asked. If I leave and they never find me, will Crane come after you? I can handle Crane, Xander said. I have been handling men like him my whole life. That is not an answer, Grace pressed. Xander smiled slightly, the first real smile she had seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and considerably more handsome. No, I suppose it is not. Truth is, there is always risk, but I knew that when I decided to help you. I'm not sorry for it. You should be, Grace said. I am nothing but trouble for you. Maybe, Xander said. Or maybe you are someone who needs help, and I am someone who can provide it. That is enough for me. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she had not experienced in a very long time. Since her father's death 5 years ago, she had been alone in the world except for her ailing mother, and the weight of that loneliness had been crushing at times. Now here was this stranger offering kindness without expectation, and she found herself wanting to know more about him. Tell me about your ranch, she said. How long have you been there? Xander looked surprised by the question, but he settled back in his chair. 10 years now. Bought it with money I saved working cattle drives up from Texas to Kansas. It is not much, just a small operation. Run about 200 head of cattle, a few horses. I do most of the work myself. Hire on some help during branding season. You said you have a sister, Grace prompted. Any other family? Brother Thomas. He runs a freight business in Colorado. Parents died about 15 years back, fever. It was just the 3 of us kids, and we scattered after that. Hannah went east, like I said. Thomas went north. I stayed here because I like the land. Do you miss them? Sometimes, Xander admitted. But we write letters, and they seem happy in their lives. That's what matters. What about you? Grace asked. Are you happy? Xander considered the question seriously. I am content. The ranch is good work, honest work. I like being my own boss, answering to no one. Could do with some better neighbors, I suppose. Crane's been trying to buy my land for years. Says he wants to expand his holdings. I keep saying no, which does not make him happy. Is that why you helped me? Grace asked. So because you already do not like Crane? I helped you because you needed help, Xander said firmly. Crane's got nothing to do with it. Though I will admit it does not hurt that protecting you likely irritates him considerably. Grace laughed, surprising herself. It felt strange to laugh after everything that had happened, but also good, like a release of pressure. I should get back, Xander said, standing. But I will come again in a few days. Think about what I said about Jacob's ranch. You do not have to decide right away, but you should decide soon. The longer you stay here, the more risk there is. I will think about it, Grace promised. Xander nodded and moved toward the door. But he paused before leaving, turning back to look at her with an expression she could not quite read. Grace, he said, whatever you saw that night, whatever made you run, I want you to know something. You are not defined by that moment. You are not just someone running from trouble. You are a person with a life ahead of you, and you deserve the chance to live it. Before Grace could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Grace stood in the middle of the cabin, her heart doing strange things in her chest. She moved to the window and watched Xander ride away, his figure growing smaller against the vast prairie landscape. Something was happening inside her, something she had not expected and was not entirely sure she wanted. She was starting to care about Xander Gaines, more than just gratitude for his help. She found herself thinking about his smile, the calm steadiness of his presence, the way he treated her like a person worthy of respect even when she was at her most desperate. It was foolish, she told herself. She barely knew him, and she was in no position to develop feelings for anyone, not when she was hiding from murderers and might have to flee to another county at any moment. But the heart, Grace was learning, did not much care about logic. Over the next 2 weeks, Xander came to the cabin 4 more times. Each visit he brought supplies and news from town. The story about Morrison's murder had settled into the official narrative. Robbers had killed him for his money, and the sheriff was investigating. Crane continued to put on his show of concern, even attending Morrison's funeral and offering condolences to the family. Grace felt sick every time Xander reported this. The injustice of it burned in her chest. Morrison's family would never know the truth, and his murderers walked free. But what could she do? Going forward would mean her death, and Xander's too probably for harboring her. So she stayed hidden and tried to make peace with her helplessness. During Xander's visits, they talked. At first, the conversations were practical, focused on her needs and the situation in town, but gradually they became more personal. Grace told him about her childhood in Tennessee, about her father who had been a horse trainer and her mother who had taken ill with a wasting sickness that left her bedridden. She told him about coming to Fort Worth to find work, hoping to earn enough to pay for doctors, and how the hotel job had seemed like a blessing until that terrible night. Xander in turn told her more about his life. He spoke of his years working cattle drives, the hard and dangerous work of moving thousands of animals across hundreds of miles. He told her about the storms and stampedes, the river crossings where men and cattle could drown in minutes, the constant threat of rustlers and hostile encounters. "Why did you leave that life?" Grace asked during one visit. They were sitting outside the cabin enjoying the spring sunshine while it lasted. Xander had insisted she needed fresh air and promised to keep watch. "Got tired of the wandering," Xander said. He was whittling a piece of wood, his hands moving with practiced ease. Every drive, we would pass through good land that could support cattle year-round. I kept thinking, why am I moving someone else's herd across this land when I could have my own? So I saved every penny, worked an extra year, and bought my place. Do you regret it? Not for a second, Xander said. He looked up from his whittling, his gray eyes meeting hers. This land, it gets in your blood. The space, the freedom. I could not go back to working for someone else now. I think I understand that, Grace said. The freedom part. Even working at the hotel, I was always aware of being watched, judged. Mr. Patterson, the owner, he was a decent man, but he made it clear that his girls, as he called us, had to maintain a certain reputation. One misstep, and you were out. Seems like a hard way to live, Xander observed. It was the only way I knew, Grace said. But being here, even hiding like I am, there is something liberating about it. No one watching, no one judging, just me and the land. And me, Xander said with a slight smile. I am watching sometimes. That is different, Grace said, and felt her cheeks warm. You are not judging. No, Xander agreed, his voice softer. I am definitely not judging. There was a moment of silence, charged with something Grace could not quite name. Then Xander cleared his throat and returned his attention to his whittling. I heard back from Jacob, he said. He has a spot for a housekeeper if you're interested. His wife passed 2 years back, and he has been managing on his own, but he admits the house is a disaster. He could use the help, and he's offering fair wages and a private room. Grace's stomach tightened. She knew she should take the offer. It was the smart thing, the safe thing, but the thought of leaving filled her with an ache she did not want to examine too closely. When would I need to leave? She asked. Whenever you are ready, Xander said. Jacob is in no rush and he understands the situation. Well, part of it anyway. I told him you were running from some trouble and needed a fresh start. He did not ask for details. He sounds like a good friend. The best, Xander confirmed. Saved my life once during a drive. Stampede scattered the herd and I got thrown from my horse, broke my leg. Jacob stayed with me through the night, fought off coyotes, kept me alive until the others found us. That is the kind of man he is. Then I should go, Grace said, trying to sound certain. It is the right decision. Probably, Xander said, but he did not sound happy about it either. That night, after Xander had left, Grace lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Her mind churned with conflicting thoughts and feelings. She should be grateful for this opportunity, for the chance to start over safely. Instead, she felt like she was about to lose something precious. She had fallen for Xander Gaines, completely, irrevocably fallen for him. It had happened so gradually that she had not noticed until it was too late. Now the thought of leaving him, of never seeing him again, was almost unbearable. But what choice did she have? She could not stay hidden in this cabin forever, and she could not ask Xander to upend his life for her. He had already done so much. Grace turned over, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. Tomorrow she would tell Xander she was ready to go to Jacob's ranch. It was the right thing to do, the smart thing, even if it broke her heart. When Xander arrived 3 days later, Grace had her answer ready. But before she could speak, she saw the expression on his face and knew something had happened. What is it? She asked, fear spiking through her. Crane's men were at my place again yesterday, Xander said. He looked tired, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. They did not search this time, just made threats. Said Crane is getting impatient. Said it would be a shame if something happened to my cattle or my buildings. Said maybe I should reconsider selling to him. He is going to hurt you because of me, Grace said, the words tasting bitter. He is making threats because he is a bully who is used to getting his way, Xander corrected. This is not your fault. It is, though, Grace insisted. If I had never run to your ranch. Then you would be dead, Xander interrupted, his voice sharp. Is that what you wish? That you had not run to me? No, Grace admitted, but I hate that you are suffering for helping me. Xander crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He took her hands in his grip warm and strong. Grace looked up at him, startled by the sudden movement and the intensity in his eyes. "Listen to me," Xander said. "I made a choice that night. I knew the risks and I chose to help you anyway. I would make the same choice again. Do you understand?" "Why?" Grace whispered. "Why would you risk so much for a stranger?" "Because you were not just a stranger," Xander said. "From the moment you looked at me with those frightened eyes and asked for help, you were someone who mattered. And now—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Now?" Grace prompted, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Now you matter even more," Xander finished. He released her hands and stepped back, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "I should not say this. You need to go to Jacob's ranch where you will be safe. Getting tangled up with me is the last thing you need." "What if I want to get tangled up with you?" Grace asked. The words were out before she could stop them, bold and reckless. Xander stared at her. "Grace." "I am falling in love with you," Grace said, and now that she had started, she could not seem to stop. "I know it is foolish and impractical and terrible timing. I know I should go to Jacob's ranch and start over and forget about you, but I cannot. I think about you constantly. I wait for your visits like they are the only thing keeping me alive. And when you leave, it feels like part of me goes with you." "I am falling in love with you too," Xander said, the words rough and honest. "Have been for days now. Maybe from the start. I do not know. I just know that every time I ride away from here, it gets harder. And the thought of you leaving, of never seeing you again, it makes me feel like I am being torn in half." They stood staring at each other, the confession hanging between them. Then Xander moved. He crossed to Grace in one swift motion and pulled her into his arms. Grace came willingly, her hands clutching at his shirt as his mouth found hers. The kiss was everything. Desperate and tender, urgent and gentle. Grace felt like she was falling and being caught at the same time. Xander's arms were strong around her, holding her like she was something precious. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "What are we going to do?" he asked. "I do not know," Grace admitted, "but we will figure it out. Together." "Together," Xander echoed. Then he kissed her again, softer this time, like a promise. They spent the rest of that day together talking and planning. The situation was complicated, but they were determined to find a solution. Grace could not go back to Fort Worth, that was certain. But maybe she did not need to go to Jacob's ranch either. Maybe there was another option. "What if you sold your ranch?" Grace suggested at one point. "We could go somewhere else, somewhere Crane cannot reach." "I have thought about that," Xander admitted, "but it would take months to sell, and I would not get a fair price if people knew I was desperate. Crane would probably make sure of it." "Then what?" Xander was quiet for a long moment. "I have been thinking. My brother Thomas, he has been asking me to come to Colorado for years. Says there is good land there, room to expand. He has connections, could help me get started with a new herd." "Colorado," Grace repeated. "That is far from Crane." "Very far," Xander agreed. "And if we went together as man and wife, no one would question it. We would be just another couple looking to start fresh in new territory." Grace's heart leaped at the words man and wife. But she forced herself to be practical. "You would give up your ranch for me, everything you have built?" "I would be giving it up for us," Xander corrected. "And maybe it is time for a new start anyway. Truth is, I have been feeling restless this past year. The ranch is good, but it is small. There's not much room for growth here. In Colorado, with Thomas's help, I could build something bigger. Something that could support a family." "A family," Grace echoed, the words making her chest tight with emotion. Xander took her hands again. "I am getting ahead of myself. I know this is fast, probably too fast. But Grace, I meant what I said. I am falling in love with you. Maybe I already have fallen. And if you will have me, I would like to marry you. I would like to take you to Colorado and build a life together. A real life, with a home and maybe children someday if you want them." Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. Yes, she said. Yes to all of it. I want that too. Xander pulled her close and kissed her again, and Grace felt the last of her fear melt away. They would face whatever came together. Over the next week, Xander began quietly making arrangements. He could not sell his ranch outright without raising suspicions, but he could leave it in the care of a trusted hand, a man named Simon Reed who had worked for him during previous seasons. Simon was older, steady, and had been looking for an opportunity to settle down. Xander offered him a deal: manage the ranch, take a percentage of the profits, and purchase it outright over time if he chose. Simon agreed immediately, sensing the opportunity. He did not ask too many questions about why Xander was suddenly willing to leave, and Xander appreciated the discretion. Meanwhile, Grace stayed hidden at the line cabin, but now instead of feeling like a prisoner, she felt like she was waiting for the start of an adventure. Xander visited as often as he dared, and they made plans for their future. They decided to marry before leaving for Colorado. Xander knew a circuit preacher who rode through the county, a good man named Reverend Matthews, who could be trusted to be discreet. Xander sent word, and Reverend Matthews agreed to meet them at a small church in a town 30 miles east, far enough from Fort Worth that they were unlikely to be recognized. On a bright morning in early April, Grace dressed in the nicest clothes Xander had been able to acquire for her, a simple but pretty blue dress and a bonnet to shade her face. Xander wore his best clothes, a suit he admitted he had not worn in years. He looked uncomfortable but also handsome, and when he smiled at her, Grace felt her heart might burst. They rode together to the small church, arriving just as the sun reached its zenith. Reverend Matthews was waiting, an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He asked no questions beyond the necessary ones and seemed genuinely happy to be performing the ceremony. The church was empty except for the three of them, but Grace did not mind. She did not need witnesses or flowers or any of the trappings of a grand wedding. All she needed was Xander, who stood before her now, and took her hands in his. Reverend Matthews spoke the traditional words, and Grace and Xander repeated their vows. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Xander kissed her with such tenderness that Grace felt tears spring to her eyes again. "I love you," Xander whispered against her lips. "I love you too," Grace whispered back. They were married. Grace Atwood was now Grace Gaines, and the name felt like both a shield and a promise. After the ceremony, they stayed the night in the town, at a small hotel where no one knew them. It was their wedding night, and Xander was patient and gentle, making Grace feel cherished and safe. They held each other through the night, talking softly about their dreams and plans, and Grace thought she had never been happier. The next morning, they began the journey back. But as they approached the area near Xander's ranch, he grew tense. "Something is wrong," he said, staring ahead. Grace followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. There was smoke rising in the distance, dark and heavy against the blue sky. Xander spurred his horse forward, and Grace followed. As they drew closer, the source of the smoke became clear. Xander's ranch buildings were burning. They arrived to find the house and barn engulfed in flames. Simon Reed was there, along with two other men fighting the fire with buckets of water from the well. But it was clear they were losing the battle. Xander dismounted and ran to help, and Grace slid from her horse as well. Simon saw them and came over, his face smudged with soot. "I'm sorry, Xander," he said. "They came last night, Crane's men, set the fires and rode off. I tried to stop them, but there were too many." "Anyone hurt?" Xander asked, his voice tight. "No, thank the Lord, but the buildings are gone." Grace watched the flames consume what had been Xander's home, his life's work, and felt rage boil up inside her. This was her fault. Crane had done this because of her, because Xander had helped her. But when she looked at Xander, expecting to see anger or regret, she saw only determination. "It is just wood and nails," he said. "We can rebuild." "No," Grace said. "We are leaving, like we planned. Colorado. We are leaving now." Xander looked at her, then at the burning buildings, then back at her. He nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "There is nothing left here for us. Simon, the ranch is yours now if you want it. I will send papers from Colorado making it official. You have my gratitude for trying to save it." "You are leaving?" Simon asked. "We are," Xander confirmed. "Starting fresh. It is time." They spent the rest of that day salvaging what they could from the wreckage. It was not much. Some tools, a few personal items that had survived, but it was enough. That evening, as the sun set and the ruins of the ranch still smoldered, Xander and Grace prepared to leave. They had 2 horses, supplies for the journey, and each other. It would have to be enough. Before they rode out, Grace took one last look at the destruction. She felt guilt and anger warring inside her, but underneath those feelings was something else: determination. Crane had taken Xander's home, but he had not broken them. If anything, he had made them stronger. "Are you ready?" Xander asked, sitting on his horse beside her. Grace looked at her husband, at the man who had given up everything to protect her, and felt love surge through her so powerfully it took her breath away. "I am ready," she said. "Let us go home." "Home," Xander repeated and smiled. "I like the sound of that." They rode north as the stars began to appear, heading toward Colorado and whatever future awaited them there. The journey to Colorado took 2 weeks. Xander and Grace traveled carefully, avoiding main roads when possible, and keeping their heads down in the towns where they stopped for supplies. Xander had enough money saved to see them through, and he assured Grace that his brother Thomas would help them get established once they arrived. The land changed as they traveled, becoming more rugged and mountainous. Grace, who had spent most of her life in the relatively flat terrain of Tennessee and Texas, found herself awed by the towering peaks and deep valleys. It was beautiful and wild, and she felt her spirits lift despite the circumstances that had driven them here. Xander was a good traveling companion. He knew how to live off the land, supplementing their supplies with fish from streams and occasional small game. At night they camped under the stars, and Grace learned to appreciate the vast silence of the wilderness. It was so different from the constant noise of Fort Worth, and she found peace in it. They talked as they traveled, learning more about each other with each passing day. Grace discovered that Xander had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. He, in turn, seemed delighted by her observations about the world, the way she noticed small details and found beauty in unexpected places. "You see things differently than most people," he told her one evening as they sat by their campfire. "It is like you are looking at the world for the first time." "In some ways I am," Grace said. "I spent so much of my life just surviving, just getting through each day. I never had time to really look at things. But now, even with everything that has happened, I feel like I am really seeing for the first time." "I am glad," Xander said softly. "You deserve to see all the good things in the world." They crossed into Colorado territory on a sunny spring afternoon. The mountains loomed larger here, still capped with snow despite the warming temperatures. Xander led them toward a town called Silver Creek, where his brother had settled. Silver Creek was a bustling frontier town, larger than Fort Worth and considerably more chaotic. The streets were crowded with freight wagons and miners and all manner of people seeking their fortunes in the silver mines that dotted the mountains. Xander navigated through the chaos with ease, leading them to a sturdy building near the edge of town. A sign out front read "Gaines Freight and Supply." They dismounted, and Xander had barely tied his horse when the door burst open and a man emerged. He looked like Xander, with the same strong build and gray eyes, though his hair was lighter and his face less weathered. "Xander," Thomas Gaines exclaimed, grabbing his brother in a bear hug. "I got your letter but did not expect you so soon. And this must be Grace." He turned to her with a warm smile, and Grace found herself smiling back. Thomas had an open, friendly manner that put her immediately at ease. "Grace, this is my brother Thomas," Xander said. "Thomas, my wife Grace." "Wife?" Thomas's eyes widened. "You work fast, brother." "But I am delighted. Welcome to the family, Grace." He shook her hand enthusiastically, and Grace felt some of the tension she had been carrying ease. Whatever challenges lay ahead, at least they would have family here. Thomas insisted they stay with him while they got settled. He lived in a house behind his business, a comfortable place with room to spare. That first night, over a dinner Thomas's cook prepared, Xander explained in more detail what had happened in Texas. Thomas listened with a darkening expression. "That is quite a story," he said when Xander finished. "And you are sure this Crane fellow will not come after you here?" "I am sure," Xander said. "He has no authority in Colorado, and honestly, I doubt he cares enough to pursue us this far. He got what he wanted, me off my land. He will probably buy it from Simon eventually at a cut rate." "Still, you should be careful," Thomas warned. "Men like that have long memories." "We will be careful," Grace promised. Over the next weeks, Thomas proved invaluable in helping them get established. He knew everyone in Silver Creek and the surrounding area, and he put those connections to work. He introduced Xander to a rancher named Douglas McNeil, who was selling off part of his land, a good stretch of valley with water rights and grass for cattle. The price was fair, and with Thomas willing to extend credit for the rest, Xander was able to purchase it. It was a new start, a new ranch in a new territory, and though it was smaller than what he had left behind, there was room to grow. Grace and Xander moved into a small cabin on the property while they began the work of building a proper house. It was hard work, physically demanding, but Grace found she did not mind. She had spent too many years indoors working in a hotel. Now she was outside under the big sky, working beside her husband to build their future. Thomas visited often, always cheerful and helpful. He clearly adored his brother and seemed pleased that Xander had finally settled down. He also seemed to enjoy having Grace as a sister-in-law, treating her with a mixture of respect and affectionate teasing that made her feel truly part of the family. As spring turned to summer, the new house began to take shape. It was not grand, but it was solid and well built, with 2 bedrooms, a large main room, and a kitchen that made Grace sigh with happiness. Xander had insisted on a good stove and a window that looked out over the valley, and Grace loved both features. They acquired cattle, a small herd to start, and Xander hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work. Grace took on the cooking and household management and discovered she had a talent for it. She also began keeping chickens and started a vegetable garden, enjoying the satisfaction of growing their own food. Life in Colorado was different from life in Texas. The altitude took some getting used to, and the winters, Thomas warned, would be harsh. But Grace found she loved it. The air was clean and crisp, the mountains were breathtaking, and most importantly, she felt safe. As months passed, the memory of that terrible night in Fort Worth began to fade, though it never disappeared entirely. Sometimes Grace would wake from nightmares, seeing Peter Morrison's dead eyes staring at her. But Xander was always there, holding her and reminding her that she was safe, that the past was behind them. In late summer, Grace realized she had missed her monthly courses. At first, she thought it was stress or the changes in climate and altitude, but when another month passed and she began experiencing morning nausea, the truth became clear. She was with child. Grace was both terrified and overjoyed. She had always wanted children someday, but the timing seemed precarious. They were still establishing the ranch, still settling into their new life. Was this really the right time to bring a baby into the world? But when she told Xander, his reaction erased all her doubts. His face lit up with such pure joy that Grace felt her own fears melt away. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. He pulled her close and held her gently, as if she might break. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Xander said. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I love you so much, Grace, and I already love this baby." Thomas was equally delighted when they told him. He immediately began making plans to help, insisting he would be the best uncle any child had ever had. Grace found his enthusiasm touching and helped ease her lingering worries. As fall arrived and the aspens turned gold on the mountainsides, Grace's belly began to round. She felt the baby move for the first time in October, a fluttering sensation that made her cry with joy. Xander would place his hand on her stomach in the evenings, marveling at the kicks and movements. "He is strong," Xander would say, "just like his mother." "Or she is strong," Grace would counter, "just like her father." They did not care if the baby was a boy or girl. They just wanted a healthy child. Winter came hard and cold, just as Thomas had warned. Snow piled high around the cabin and house, and the work of keeping the cattle alive became grueling. But Xander and his hired hands managed, and Grace kept the house warm and welcoming, a haven against the bitter cold outside. Grace's time came in February, during a brief warm spell when the snow had begun to melt. Xander sent one of the hands to fetch the midwife from Silver Creek, a competent woman named Mrs. Fletcher, who had delivered half the babies in the county. The labor was long and difficult. Grace had known it would hurt, but the reality exceeded anything she had imagined. But Xander stayed by her side through all of it, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement, and that made all the difference. When the baby finally arrived, the midwife cleaned him off and placed him in Grace's arms. Him. A son. "He is perfect," Grace whispered, staring at the tiny face. The baby had dark hair like Xander and the same determined chin. "He is beautiful," Xander agreed, his voice thick with emotion, "just like his mama." They named him James, after Grace's father, James Gaines. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, and Grace felt her heart expand to accommodate this new, overwhelming love. Thomas came to visit as soon as the weather allowed, bearing gifts for his new nephew. He held James with surprising gentleness for such a big man and declared him the finest baby in Colorado Territory. Life settled into a new rhythm after James was born. The days were busy with the demands of a newborn and the ongoing work of the ranch. But Grace had never been happier. She had a husband she loved, a beautiful son, and a home that was truly hers. Sometimes late at night, when she nursed James while Xander slept beside her, Grace would think about how different her life could have been. If she had not run that night, if Xander had not helped her, if they had not fallen in love. She had faced something terrible, had run for her life, and in the process had found everything she never knew she wanted. As James grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Xander's hard work and skill with cattle paid off, and they were able to expand their herd. They hired more help and built additional outbuildings. The ranch was becoming something substantial, something that could support them for years to come. Grace stayed busy with James and the household, but she also began involving herself more in the community. She made friends among the other ranch wives and families in the area. She discovered she had a talent for nursing and began helping when people in the area fell ill. Her calm demeanor and gentle manner made her popular, and people began seeking her out for help. When James was 2 years old, Grace realized she was pregnant again. This time, the experience was easier, familiar. She knew what to expect, and her body seemed to remember what to do. Their daughter was born on a bright spring morning, arriving so quickly that Mrs. Fletcher barely made it in time. Grace held the tiny girl and felt that same overwhelming rush of love. "What should we name her?" Xander asked, gently touching the baby's soft cheek. "What about Sarah?" Grace suggested. "After your mother?" Xander's eyes grew bright with emotion. "I would like that very much." Sarah Gaines was as different from her brother as night from day. Where James had been a serious, watchful baby, Sarah was all smiles and laughter. She adored her big brother, who was endlessly patient with her. Life continued to be good. The ranch grew. James and Sarah thrived. Grace and Xander's love deepened with each passing year, the initial passion maturing into something even stronger, a partnership built on respect, trust, and genuine affection. When James was 5 and Sarah 3, a letter arrived from Tennessee. Grace's mother had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Grace grieved, but she was also grateful that her mother had lived long enough for Grace to visit her the previous year, bringing the grandchildren to meet her. Her mother had been so proud of the life Grace had built, so happy to see her daughter thriving. Thomas remained a constant presence in their lives. He never married, claiming he was too busy with his business, but Grace suspected he simply had not met the right woman. He doted on his niece and nephew, bringing them gifts and telling them outrageous stories that made them laugh. The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. James learned to ride almost before he could walk, showing a natural talent with horses that reminded Grace of her father. Sarah proved to have her Uncle Thomas's head for business, constantly coming up with schemes and plans even as a small child. When James was 8 and Sarah 6, Grace realized she was pregnant once more. This pregnancy was unexpected and harder than the previous ones. At 34, she felt the physical demands more keenly. But when another son arrived, healthy and squalling, Grace's concerns faded. They named him Daniel, and he proved to be the most adventurous of their children, constantly getting into mischief and giving Grace new gray hairs. The ranch continued to prosper. Xander's reputation as a fair and skilled rancher grew, and they became respected members of the community. Grace's work helping the sick earned her equal respect. Together they built not just a ranch, but a legacy. Sometimes visitors would come through from Texas, and Grace's heart would still skip with fear. But as more years passed, the fear faded. Crane's reach did not extend this far, and even if he had wanted revenge, Grace and Xander were protected by distance, by Thomas's connections, and by their own standing in the community. The children grew. James became a skilled horseman and rancher, working alongside his father. Sarah developed a sharp mind for numbers and began helping her Uncle Thomas with his business accounts. Daniel, true to his adventurous nature, talked about becoming an explorer or a lawman. Grace watched her children grow with a mixture of pride and bittersweet awareness of time passing. But she and Xander still had each other, their love as strong as ever. On quiet evenings, they would sit together on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the mountains, and Grace would think about the long, winding path that had brought them here. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Xander one such evening. The children were grown now, James married with a child of his own, Sarah engaged to a young lawyer in Silver Creek, Daniel off learning the frontier from a surveying crew. Leaving Texas? Starting over? Xander looked at her, his gray eyes still as clear and steady as they had been the night they met. His hair was gray now, too, matching his eyes, and there were lines on his face that spoke of years of hard work and laughter. "Not for a single moment," he said. "Every choice I made that night and every day since, I would make again. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Gaines." "And you are the best thing that ever happened to me," Grace said. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of their home. The creak of the house settling, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through the trees they had planted years ago. Grace thought about that terrible night in Fort Worth, about seeing something she should never have seen, about running for her life. She thought about the cowboy who had hidden her and asked nothing at all, who had protected her without question or expectation of reward. That cowboy sat beside her now, her husband of more than 20 years, the father of her children, the love of her life. What had started in fear and desperation had transformed into something beautiful. They had built a good life together, full of love and laughter and hard work. They had raised children who were strong and kind. They had created a home that stood as a testament to the power of courage and compassion. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Grace felt a deep sense of peace. The past was behind them. The future stretched ahead, full of grandchildren to spoil and new adventures to share. But this moment right now, sitting beside Xander with the mountains standing sentinel around them, was perfect. "I love you," she said softly. "I love you too," Xander replied, his voice warm with the depth of decades of devotion. Always have, always will. And that, Grace thought, was the simple, beautiful truth of it. They had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and had built something lasting and true. They had faced fear and danger and uncertainty, and they had emerged stronger for it. The Wild West had given them challenges and hardships, but it had also given them each other. And that, Grace knew with absolute certainty, was worth everything. As they sat together under the vast Colorado sky, Grace felt the story of their love settling around her like a warm blanket. It had been fast-paced and intense at the beginning, but it had deepened into something profound and enduring. They had created a family, a legacy, a love that would outlast them both. The ranch would continue. James would take over when Xander was ready to step back, and Daniel had recently surprised them by announcing he wanted to return and help expand the operation. Sarah and her lawyer husband talked about settling in Silver Creek permanently, close enough to visit often. Thomas, now in his 60s but still spry and sharp, had finally started courting a widow in town. Grace teased him mercilessly about it, delighted to see her brother-in-law finally finding companionship. Life was good. Life was rich and full, and exactly what Grace had never dared to dream of during those desperate days hiding in the line cabin. She thought about the woman she had been then, young, terrified, alone. And she thought about the woman she was now, strong, confident, surrounded by love. The transformation had been gradual, but it had been real. Xander had given her that. Not just safety, though he had certainly provided that. But he had given her the space to become herself, to grow into the person she was meant to be. He had seen her at her most vulnerable and had responded with kindness and respect. He had never made her feel weak or ashamed for needing help. And she had given him things too, she knew. Companionship, love, a family, purpose, and partnership. They had built their life together, brick by brick, day by day. "Are you getting cold?" Xander asked, feeling her shiver slightly in the evening air. "A little," Grace admitted. "Let us go inside," Xander said. "I will make us some tea." They stood, Xander's hand finding hers naturally, and walked into their home. The house was quiet now that the children were grown and gone, but it was still full of warmth and life. Grace had made sure of that. In the kitchen, Xander put the kettle on while Grace settled into her favorite chair by the stove. She watched her husband move around the kitchen with familiar ease. He had learned to cook over the years, especially after Grace had suffered a bout of illness a few years back. It was one of the many small ways they cared for each other. "Do you remember the first meal I cooked for you?" Grace asked. "At the line cabin?" "You burned the beans," Xander said with a smile. "Said you were too nervous to focus on cooking." "I was terrified," Grace admitted. "Not of you, but of everything. I kept thinking Crane's men would burst through the door any second. But they never did," Xander said. He brought her a cup of tea and sat across from her. "We were careful, and we were lucky, and we made it through." "We did more than make it through," Grace said. "We thrived. We built something wonderful." "We did," Xander agreed. "And it started because you were brave enough to run, and I was lucky enough to be standing in the right place at the right time." "You were more than lucky," Grace said. "You were good. You saw someone in need, and you helped without asking for anything in return. That takes a special kind of person." "I am not that special," Xander protested. "Yes, you are," Grace insisted. "You are the best man I have ever known, Xander Gaines, and I am grateful every single day that I ran to your ranch that night." Xander reached across the table and took her hand. "And I am grateful every day that you did. You changed my life, Grace, made it better in every possible way." They sat together in the warm kitchen, drinking tea and talking softly about their day, their children, their plans for tomorrow. It was ordinary and domestic and absolutely perfect. Later, as they prepared for bed, Grace looked at herself in the mirror. She was older now, her face lined, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes were bright and her smile was genuine. She looked like a woman who had lived and loved and found happiness. In the bedroom, Xander was already under the covers, reading by lamplight. He looked up when Grace entered and smiled, setting his book aside. "Come here," he said, opening his arms. Grace slipped into bed beside him, snuggling against his warmth. He wrapped his arms around her, and she sighed contentedly. "I love our life," she said softly. "I love you." "I love you too," Xander replied, "more than words can say." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, safe and warm and loved. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing of seasons and the milestones of their growing family. James and his wife had 3 children, making Grace and Xander grandparents several times over. Sarah married her lawyer, and they had twin boys who were as mischievous as their uncle Daniel had been. Daniel eventually married a surveyor's daughter, and they settled on a parcel of land adjacent to the main ranch, expanding the family holdings. Thomas finally married his widow, a kind woman named Martha who ran a successful boarding house in Silver Creek. They were happy together, and Grace was delighted to see her brother-in-law finally settled. The ranch continued to prosper under Xander's steady hand and James's enthusiastic management. They weathered economic downturns and harsh winters, but they always came through because they worked together and supported each other. Grace and Xander aged gracefully together, their love deepening with each passing year. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed each other good morning and good night, still found joy in each other's company. When Xander turned 65, the family threw a grand celebration. All the children and grandchildren gathered, along with friends from throughout the county. There was food and music and laughter, and Grace looked around at the gathering with profound satisfaction. This was what they had built. Not just a ranch, but a family. A legacy of love and hard work and devotion. Xander made a speech, thanking everyone for coming and for being part of their lives. But when he looked at Grace, his voice grew softer, more intimate, even though everyone could hear. "Most of all, I want to thank my wife," he said. "Grace came into my life when I least expected it, and she changed everything. She gave me love, family, purpose. She made me better than I ever could have been on my own. Every good thing in my life can be traced back to her. So thank you, Grace, for running to my ranch that night. And thank you for staying by my side ever since." Grace felt tears stream down her face, but they were happy tears. She stood and crossed to Xander, kissing him while their family and friends applauded and cheered. "Thank you for hiding me," Grace whispered against his lips, "and for asking nothing at all. Thank you for giving me everything." They held each other while the party continued around them, 2 people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and had built a lifetime of light together. As the sun set that evening, painting the Colorado sky in shades of pink and gold, Grace and Xander stood together on their porch, watching their family. James was teaching his oldest son to rope a fence post. Sarah was laughing at something her husband had said. Daniel was arguing good-naturedly with Thomas about horses. The grandchildren were running wild, playing some invented game that seemed to involve a lot of shouting and laughter. "We did good," Xander said quietly. "We did very good," Grace agreed. And they had. Against all odds, despite the terrible circumstances that had brought them together, they had created something beautiful and lasting. They had proved that love could grow from fear, that kindness could change lives, that 2 people who barely knew each other could become partners for a lifetime. The Wild West had been harsh and unforgiving, but it had also been the setting for their love story, and Grace would not change a single moment of it. As the stars began to appear and the last light faded from the sky, Grace and Xander went inside their home, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, secure in the knowledge that they would face it together, as they always had. And they lived happily, surrounded by love and family for many years to come. Their story became part of the family lore, passed down to children and grandchildren, a testament to courage and kindness and the transformative power of love. Grace and Xander Gaines had started with nothing but fear and hope, and they had built a legacy that would endure for generations. It was, Grace thought in her later years, the very best ending she could have imagined. Better, even. Because it was real, and it was theirs. And it had all begun on a desperate night when she saw something terrible and ran for her life, and a cowboy hit her and asked nothing at all.